Hello everyone. Tomorrow marks the 75th anniversary of the D-Day invasion. So I just wanted to do this video to talk about my dad's role in that historical event. 75 years ago, my dad was somewhere in southern England waiting to get onto a ship to help invade France the next day. I can imagine the thoughts that were going through his mind on that night. He really didn't know whether he would live that day or not. Thankfully he did, and I just want to relate a bit of that story to you. So my dad was born and raised very close to this area I live in right now. Back in those days, this was a remote area, and where he was raised was even more remote. My grandfather was somewhat of a mountain man, so my dad and his two sisters lived basically out in the middle of nowhere. My dad had a grade 8 education. When he finished grade 8, I think that was the minimum amount that the government would allow you to go to school. So as soon as he finished grade 8, he immediately dropped out of school, and he had to go to work just simply to feed the family, help feed the family. That was in the 1930s, during the Depression, so living was difficult to say the least. So as a young man, he ended up working in the forestry industry. He was a logger. These days, it's still very hard work, even though the industry is highly mechanized now. Back when he was working in it, it was all mostly manual labor. I have pictures somewhere where he was skidding logs out with horse teams, that sort of thing. So he joined the Army in 1942. I never did ask my dad why he decided to join the Army. At that time, the Canadian Army was an all-volunteer force. We didn't have a draft at that time. The draft came in later towards the end of the war. The draft was a very divisive political issue in the country at that time. The government didn't want to do it. Eventually they were forced to do it just because they couldn't keep up with the losses of men. But at the time he joined, like say, he was strictly volunteer. So I never did ask him why he did that, why he decided to join the Army. But my guess would be, to him it was just a way of escaping the life that he had at that time. It was very hard work, very poor, and he really didn't have much of an outlook for the future. So I think in his mind he decided by joining the Army, at least he'd get out of this area, he'd get to see something. And that was probably his primary motivation. And I'm sure he wanted to serve the country and everything as well. So this little chocolate box here, it's got the artifacts and memories from his time in the Army. So my dad belonged to the Canadian Scottish Regiment, St. Mary's. They're a British Columbia based regiment. So this is his dress cap. They had their dress uniform was this cap and Scottish type attire. I don't know what happened to the rest of his uniform, but like I say, this is the dress cap that he had with his uniform. Also got his dog tags and his service medals. I'll touch on those a little bit later. There's one medal in particular I'd like to talk about. But the most significant thing in the box is this little book. This is the Canadian Army Soldier Service and Pay Book. So basically from the time he enlisted till the time he left the Army, this book was with him. So literally this book has been to hell and back. It went with him to Europe and was with him when he was discharged from the Army. So one thing I've always wondered about in this book, there's a little inscription here, it's in my dad's writing. It says, 6 beer I owe the trapper. So I don't know who the trapper is, but I just hope that my dad paid him back the beer eventually, or the trapper live to get his beer back. So this is all inscriptions in here that detail all aspects of his service, but the most significant entry in here is, just have to find it again. Okay, here it is. So there's a line here, and it simply says, "Disembark France, 6/6/1944." So that's obviously an understatement. That's the D-Day invasion. So the Canadian Scottish, they were in the first, his company was in the first wave in their sector. So my dad he didn't really want to talk about anything to do with the war. Fortunately, I don't really know a huge amount about it. Anything I know about it, I had to basically pry out of him, because he just wasn't interested in talking about it. But one time he did tell me that as they were coming towards the shore in their landing craft, so these are all open landing craft, and the Germans had all the high ground. So what was happening is the Germans had machine guns up high, and they were strafing the boats as they came in. So a lot of the boats hit the shore, and they were just full of dead and wounded soldiers. And there was no cover inside the boats, as I say, they were completely open. So my dad said they were coming to shore, and he was looking up on the high ground, and there was a German pillbox. So as he's looking at this pillbox, the German machine gunner swung his machine gun around, and he took aim at the landing craft my dad was in. So my dad said almost the instant he did that, though, a naval shell from one of the ships hit the pillbox and destroyed it, probably saving his life and the lives of most of the people in that landing craft. So my dad said at that time he thought to himself, I might survive today. This might be my lucky day after all. So I've got a little blurb here picked up on the internet. So the Canadian Scottish Regiment was from Victoria, British Columbia. I've already said that. C Company, commanded by Major D.J. Crofton, landed at about 0750 hours and came under machine gun fire and mortar fire as they raced across the 75 to 100 yards of the beach. They found their targeted pillbox already demolished by the naval bombardment. They moved on to their second objective, Chateau Vaux. The Scottish stormed the chateau and tossed several hand grenades inside. A group of dispirited Germans quickly surrendered. So I don't know if that pillbox that they're talking about there was the same one my dad was talking about that was destroyed by the naval fire, but I think there's a very good chance it was. So he got ashore that day. He survived the first day, the second day, third day they were pushing inland, and somewhere along the line he was wounded. He was actually shot through the back. He had a huge scar where the bullet went into his back, and then a huge scar where it exited. So in the course of that battle, firefight, whatever you want to call it, he lost track of where he was, and I don't know if he lost consciousness or what happened, but long story short, he didn't know where he was. There was no one else around him. He was badly wounded. He didn't know if he should crawl towards one direction or the other, because he might be going towards the enemy lines or towards his own lines. So basically he was wounded, I think it was a couple of days. He was kind of basically crawling around, trying to find a link up with his own forces again. So eventually he came across some Allied troops, and they took him to a hospital to get some care. But as I said, in those days, after D-Day, the casualties were enormous. So if you were wounded, you were put back into service as soon as possible. So he no sooner got out of the hospital for that wound, and he participated in the liberation of Holland. So he fought in Holland for I'm not sure how long exactly, but he was wounded in Holland again. He was with standing in a group of soldiers, and a mortar round landed in the middle of them, and most of them were killed or wounded. He was quite badly wounded with shrapnel. So back to the hospital, and when he recovered from that, He was sent to Germany, participated in the liberation of Germany, but most of the fighting had died down by then. So this was a medal he received late in his life. The Dutch government came over and they made sure that every Canadian soldier that participated in the liberation of Holland was given this medal. And it just says, "Thank you, Canada," and it's got the Netherlands flag, Canadian flag on it, 1945. So he appreciated it. I thought that was a great gesture by the Netherlands government to do something like that. The people of Holland to this day are grateful for the sacrifice of the Canadian soldiers that liberated Holland. The neighbor I used to have was born in Holland. He was actually there during the war as a young boy. When he found out my father was a veteran, he personally thanked him. The Dutch people are eternally grateful for the Canadians. So this little book there, this book was on D-Day that morning. This book jumped off the ship, and it was with him when he went ashore, and it was with him in Holland when they liberated Holland. And you know, this book has a lot of significance to me. I always treasure it. Every time I miss my dad, I like to get out it, just have a quick look through it. Helps me remember him. So eventually I'm going to give this to my son, and hopefully he'll remember his grandfather, and he'll remember me too. So I think we should just take a moment, or I hope everybody takes a moment tomorrow, just to remember those incredibly brave young men, especially the ones that didn't make it, the ones that gave up their lives on D-Day. Where would we be? Where would I be? Where would this world be without their sacrifice? So I think we owe that generation a debt that can never be repaid, and I hope we never forget them. Thanks.